Thank you very much. As Mrs. Svoboda already said, peacekeeping has been a very successful venture of the United Nations, but also with some setbacks. And if you look at the UN Charter, you will see that there's no mention at all in peacekeeping. And isn't that surprising? Because I think it's often the most visible part of what the organization does. But following the early 90s, when you had crises in Somalia, you had crises in former Yugoslavia, you had crisis in Rwanda, it really became a very strong crisis at the United Nations because we were totally overstretched. And then how do you actually deal with that? And there was a first report that was commissioned by then Secretary General Kofi Annan to Lakhdar Brahimi, who did a report in 2000 which basically made a number of changes. And these changes, you will be surprised to hear, even go back as far as Boutros Ghali, because Boutros Ghali, Secretary General in 95, already said, I will tell the Security Council what it needs to hear and not what it wants to hear. And those are very often unpleasant truths. I want to skip over this because it's Elizabeth Spehar who is the highlight of tonight, of course, that there were two more reports, in particular the latest one, which was a high-level independent group on peacekeeping operations and peace operations, which was concluded a couple of years ago under Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and the most recent one, which was commissioned by Secretary General Guterres, and this is one that was Action for Peacekeeping, not only a report but also a declaration by member states to commit to principles of peacekeeping. It was a very important document. Now, Elizabeth Spehar has been a very experienced political senior official of the United Nations. She was, prior to coming to the UN, she was in the OAS, and we met first through the Haiti operation, which you might also, if it so suits you, to talk about that. And she worked for years in the political affairs department of the United Nations, political negotiations, discussions with the Secretary General as well, and therefore has a lot of background in this, and was working on Cyprus in this area, and then was posted to Cyprus as special representative of the Secretary General to Cyprus in 2016. So she's been there now for 3 years and is extremely able to talk about not only about Cyprus but also particularly about the peacekeeping and where we are right now. So Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and in particular delighted to be in the company of Ms. Angela Kane to my right. Angela and I worked very closely together in New York for a number of years in the Department of Political Affairs, and this has been a great opportunity to reunite and catch up with her. And I'm delighted to learn of the IIP through Ms. Kane. So thank you so much to the IIP for this invitation. When I was asked to speak, we were exchanging views between myself and the IIP as to how I would frame some remarks, and I thought it would be good, rather than focusing, as we've just heard, on Cyprus specifically, to zoom out more to peacekeeping in general, because I think that might perhaps resonate with a slightly larger number of you. But if there are specific questions on what we're doing in Cyprus, I'd certainly be happy to address that once we get to the Q&As. But I think we are in a very interesting time for peacekeeping, and so I thought it would be good that we explore that a little bit together, both, as was said a moment ago, the challenges but also the opportunities, and what are we able to achieve through peacekeeping even now. So as you've just heard, I'm currently based in Cyprus. I'm the Special Representative of the Secretary General and the head of the peacekeeping mission there, which is called the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Cyprus. I also have another hat, which we could always get into as well, which is to be the acting head and deputy special advisor of the good offices in Cyprus, which is the negotiation part of the UN mandate on the ground. Basically, the good offices is tasked with facilitating negotiations between the parties to arrive at a solution to the Cyprus problem. But in terms of the peacekeeping, we have been there for a long time, and so I dare say that a lot of lessons learned have been accumulated also in Cyprus with respect to peacekeeping. So I wanted to start out, as I said, by really giving you very quickly a little bit of the history of peacekeeping in the UN, talk about some of the current challenges after that, and then focus in on what Angela mentioned, which is this fairly new initiative called Action for Peacekeeping. I think that Action for Peacekeeping is an interesting tool that hopefully will help us all to galvanize a response to both the opportunities of peacekeeping nowadays and what it can achieve on the ground, but also how in getting to those achievements we make ourselves truly fit for purpose. And this is something that's been the object of quite some discussion in the UN. As Angela mentioned, it's not the first time that the United Nations has focused in on peacekeeping, seen limitations, seen problems, seen challenges, and tried to improve the practice. And she mentioned some very important earlier reports. But if I just take us back for a minute to the origins of peacekeeping, it actually started, the first peacekeeping mission of the United Nations was set up and deployed in 1948. And that was a small team of observers that was deployed in 1948 in the Middle East during the Arab-Israeli war of that year. So peacekeeping really is something that has grown up alongside the United Nations system as a whole. Really the peacekeeping role of the UN is just about as old as the UN is itself. And after that rather timid start, if you will, although in a not timid area, of course, the Middle East, after the Cold War, you saw quite an explosion of peacekeeping missions in different operating theaters across the world, and the increase was really quite rapid. And by the time we got to 1989, between 1989 and 1994, we had a total of 20 new operations that were deployed and working in a number of operating theaters. And we went, in that period, from 11,000 peacekeepers around the world all the way to 75,000, so quite a big increase. And if we take the totality of peacekeeping missions up until now, since 1948, there have been over 70 separate peace operations. And those 70 peace operations have involved hundreds of thousands of military personnel, as well as tens of thousands of UN police and civilians as well. And these are people that are coming from more than 120 countries. So you can see that in terms of the UN peace operations, it is truly a multinational effort. There are people from all over the world that contribute to the peacekeeping of the organization. Now, as peacekeeping evolved, the complexity also grew. And we started out with UN peacekeeping being pretty one-dimensional at the beginning. So most of the missions in the early days were observer missions, military missions that were set up to monitor a ceasefire or a contact line. But as time wore on and conflicts got more complex, and the needs and the interest of member states increased to have a more comprehensive solution to conflict, the peacekeeping missions got much more comprehensive and complex as well. So now we have, alongside some of the old traditional missions, and UNFICYP is one of them, what we now call multi-dimensional peacekeeping missions, which cover a wide range of tasks, and they are often integrated missions, so they have a lot of different components that's part of them, and they really cover the gamut of so many things, so not only keeping the peace, but also trying to build the peace. There's a plethora of new mandates, from human rights to protection of civilians, disarmament, demining, you name it. So they've really become much larger and much more ambitious, if you will, in a number of contexts. Now, what, as I was just mentioning, what has changed a lot over the years is the nature of conflicts. So whereas in the early days we were often looking at conflicts that were between states, now increasingly the conflicts that are being addressed are within states themselves, with a different set of actors. And in some of the more complicated theaters, you have a number of armed groups that are fighting different battles with different aims, different ideologies, some of them also using terrorist tactics. It's a very much more dense and complex situation, and also a much more dangerous one in many contexts. And that is something we hadn't seen earlier. And now if we look at where we are today and the number of missions that are deployed, we currently have 14 peacekeeping missions on the ground that are comprised of a little bit more than 110,000 military, police, and civilians. Now, this is a decrease from the height of 2017 when we had 17 active peacekeeping operations. And there is at least one peacekeeping mission that is slated, unless something has changed, to end in the next few months, and that is MINUSJUST in Haiti. And UNAMID in Darfur is also scheduled to close in the next period. So the amount of peacekeeping missions has started to shrink in the current context, but its role and the breadth of what many of these missions are doing has certainly expanded. Now, I wanted to go quickly to the challenges that many of these missions are facing, and I've alluded to some of them already. First of all, I would say that this changing nature of armed conflict has really seriously complicated the possibility of the UN to respond appropriately through its peacekeeping missions. That's both because often peacekeeping missions are given quite large, unrealistic mandates that don't really meet the needs and the complexities of the conflict on the ground. They're often not given the capabilities. And again, there's just a changing profile of actors, of armed groups, and often neighboring countries are involved. And the peacekeeping mission has a lot of challenge to addressing these very multifaceted conflicts. We're also increasingly operating in places that have a lot of vulnerable civilians. And this is where, over the last number of years, you've seen a real focus in many missions on this protection of civilians mandate. So that we are not just there to keep the peace in a general sense, we're there actually to support the human rights of the individuals on the ground and make sure that they are safe. In modern peacekeeping, at least in some of the operating theaters, we also have a new phenomenon, which is peacekeepers are now being targeted. And whereas the United Nations for many years was considered indeed to be a neutral force, to be trying to fulfill its mandate impartially, and therefore was not necessarily a direct target of conflict actors on the ground, increasingly we are targets in certain theaters, and particularly where we have mandates to actually use lethal force against certain armed groups. Now, this is quite a controversial concept, and not all member states are comfortable with it, but we do have several missions where the use of lethal force is sanctioned not only for self-protection, which was traditionally the case, but also to try to change the conflict and the political dynamics on the ground. And that has made us, again, even more of an obvious target, if you will, for some groups. I mentioned before that the mandates have grown broader and more complex, and the problem is that often what the Security Council asks a mission to do it's just not realistic given the, let's say, the political context, given the capabilities that they have received. Sometimes my colleagues talk about Christmas tree mandates, where a resolution that authorizes the establishment of a mission may run 10, 11 pages and just go through a laundry list of things that the mission is supposed to achieve. These are the kinds of things that have made the task of many missions, or a number of missions, much more difficult, and it's something that the organization is cognizant of and is trying to deal with. Peacekeeping also has performance issues. I think there is scope always for improvement. And certainly member states have increasingly been asking us to be more efficient and effective in the use of resources. There's also an issue of trying to plan better, to evaluate better what we do, and to be able to explain more both to the Security Council, other member states, and to the population, actually what we do and what we achieve. Because I think something that I hear a lot about peacekeeping and the UN role in many countries, even beyond peacekeeping, is that people don't really know what we do. They don't understand why we're there. They don't understand how we spend our days, and whether all of that effort and that money is worth it. So I think the United Nations has a challenge of doing better and performing better, but also communicating better. And certainly as the Secretary General's representatives on the ground and heads of peacekeeping missions such as myself, we do have a directive straight from the Secretary General that he wants us to be better communicators. He wants us to get out there, to explain and to engage. So that's an area that we certainly can improve on. There's also, in terms of performance, there's also the whole issue of conduct, the way that our peacekeepers are behaving on the ground. And when I say peacekeepers, people immediately think of military, but it's not just military, it's everybody. Military, the civilians, the police on the ground. We are all bound by a code of conduct, and we need to abide by that. With respect to my peacekeepers, the people that work with me, I remind them every day that whether you're in uniform or out of uniform, whether you're on duty or off duty, you represent the United Nations. You embody the principles and values of the organization, and when people see you and talk to you, even if you're having a coffee in a cafe somewhere in Nicosia, you will be identified with the United Nations, and therefore you need to behave accordingly. So the UN has really been tightening its conduct and discipline tools to make sure that people live up to the standards and the values of the United Nations, and is demanding more and more accountability. But we do know, as I'm sure you're aware, that there continue to be some serious problems. And one of the most egregious and also most publicized examples of serious breaches of conduct and discipline are in the areas of sexual exploitation and abuse. And I'm sure you've all heard of those incidents in a number of operating theaters, where not only has it done incredible damage to the UN's reputation, but above all, it has destroyed lives. And this is something that the organization takes extremely seriously. Accountability for such acts is something that is being strengthened continually. There is a final point that I think is really bedeviling us, and it's not new, but it is the difficulty of getting to political solutions and actually solving the conflicts on the ground, achieving a sustainable peace. So we have now, among these 14 peacekeeping missions, not only new peacekeeping missions that are in, if you will, new conflict areas where conflict has emerged in the last few years, but we still have the lingering old conflicts, and Cyprus is certainly in that category. And it just comes home to us every day as we're working how difficult it is to actually work with the parties and achieve a lasting peace. As was said at the beginning, it doesn't depend on the United Nations, it really depends on the actors on the ground, but we are there to play our role, and this is something we need to see how we address, and how we can get better at trying to help the parties get to political solutions. So these are just some of the key challenges that I see, and that this Action for Peacekeeping initiative has been taking a look at and trying to address. So what is Action for Peacekeeping? Action for Peacekeeping is an initiative that Secretary General Guterres launched in March of this year. And its basic aim is to try to see how we can all collectively improve peacekeeping and get real results on the ground. And for me, one of the most compelling aspects of Action for Peacekeeping is the shared commitment. So the idea is that it's not just the UN Secretariat's problem or issue, it's not just the individual peacekeeping missions on the ground, it's also member states and a wide range of stakeholders. So member states as individual members, as police contributing countries, as troop contributing countries, as host countries, and certainly as Security Council. So in September of last year, this Action for Peacekeeping initiative culminated in a declaration that was signed on to by a number of regional organizations, certainly the UN Secretariat, but also over 150 member states. And I don't want to, make it seem as if Action for Peacekeeping, or A4P as we call it in short form, is a panacea for all of peacekeeping's challenges and ills. But it is a start, I think, in the sense that, again, it gives us a certain important platform because it covers 20 very important areas under 7 headings. And it emphasizes the shared commitment, and that's something that I think is really important. Now, I won't go into detail on what it goes through, because otherwise I will go on forever, and I'd rather just answer questions if you're curious. But just to give you an idea, there are 7 broad themes that Action for Peacekeeping covers, and it covers some of the issues that I just evoked. So it tries to get, again, a sense of shared responsibility in areas such as the protection of civilians. How can we do that better? How can we enhance the safety and security of our UN peacekeepers? It addresses performance issues. It addresses also the importance of partnerships, which is interesting. The UN is increasingly trying to improve its partnerships with regional organizations like the African Union or the European Union, because we're often together in the same operating theaters with companion missions on the ground. It also covers sustaining peace, which I think is extremely important. In other words, how do we get to a peace that will last? What is the comprehensive approach that we need to take to a conflict that will allow us not only to get the guns to cease, but also to build the possibility of prosperity for the population, of reconciliation, of elements that will make this peace a lasting one. And it's seen that peacekeeping missions need to somehow have a role in that. It also covers this issue of conduct that I mentioned before, conduct and discipline. And the final one, which is actually the first one, is advancing lasting political solutions. So I put that one last because I want to dwell on it a bit, but it is the first goal in Action for Peacekeeping. So basically, everyone has acknowledged perhaps the obvious, and that is the primacy of politics. That whatever a peacekeeping mission is on the ground to do in terms of its specific mandate, whether it's monitoring or supervising a ceasefire, separating 2 belligerent forces on the ground, whatever the specific task happens to be, protection of civilians and so on, the ultimate task is to contribute to political objectives, because the UN is convinced that there are no military solutions to these conflicts. That usually just engenders further conflict. We're trying to get to peaceful solutions, and that has to happen through politics. So if I can just go quickly to UNFICYP and how our peacekeeping mission fits into all of this. Tell me if I'm going wildly over.
It's okay.
Okay. So UNFICYP is a peacekeeping mission that's been on Cyprus, been deployed in Cyprus since March of 1964. So the peacekeeping mission in Cyprus is probably older than many of you in this room. It was deployed in Cyprus in 1964 because of violence between the 2 dominant communities on the island, the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. And this started in the late 50s and continued even after the independence of Cyprus in 1960 from the United Kingdom. The original mission was only supposed to stay for about 3 months, and here we are 55 or so years later, still on the ground. The conflict evolved or degenerated, if you will, culminating in 1974. Greek junta supported coup d'etat, and then a Turkish intervention with military forces, and a de facto division of the island, so that the majority of the Greek Cypriots are living in the south, in the Republic of Cyprus. The recognized part of Cyprus, the UN member state, member of the EU, with Turkish Cypriots living in the north in an unrecognized entity that they call the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is only recognized by Turkey. I mentioned earlier that I'm also involved with the good offices, so we have 2 sister missions on the ground, one that is supposed to keep the peace, that's UNFICYP, and the other, which is the good offices, which is to help achieve a final peaceful resolution of the Cyprus problem. So when it comes to understanding how the peacekeeping mission in such a context can understand and act on the need to contribute to political objectives, the primacy of politics, one has to ask oneself, well, what would that look like? So I can tell you that over the years there has been pressure on UNFICYP from various Security Council members or from other member states in the sense that, well, you've been on the ground for decades now, things are relatively peaceful, why are you still there? And now the added question is, well, you're supposed to be responding to political objectives and achieving political solutions. If you haven't done that yet, then why are you there? Then perhaps you should close and leave. That's a long conversation in and of itself, but I will simply say that I will just tell you how UNFICYP today in 2019 understands its mandate. It's a very old mandate from 1964 in the context of action for peacekeeping and needing to contribute to political objectives. And that is the following. We have our sister mission that is supporting the negotiations. When there are negotiations, they're currently in hiatus, I should add. We are there to help create conditions conducive to a successful and a sustainable outcome. A settlement deal finally on Cyprus that will endure. And how do we do that? Through two main things that we work on every day at UNFICYP in Cyprus. We are keeping calm and stability in and around the buffer zone, which is a large, almost 3% of the territory on Cyprus, 180 kilometers long buffer zone up to 7 kilometers wide, with opposing forces arrayed on either side of the lines, so that will permit the proper context and atmosphere for successful negotiations to go forward. And the second pillar of how we create conditions conducive is by supporting Cypriots in their efforts towards reconciliation and trust building. So helping Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots who wish to engage, who wish to work together, to cooperate, and who wish to see peace and reunification on the island, help them to get together, support them, and hopefully see that be a growing tendency on the island. That is how we interpret the political part of our mandate. So let me just start to wrap up, because I don't want to monopolize the time and not have a chance for a conversation. But I would just say that in light of where we are with peacekeeping and the multiple challenges, while it's not a panacea, I think the Action for Peacekeeping Declaration is something useful that we can use as a starting point to improve the way we do our work and hopefully to get better results. But for me, the main ingredient that will test whether we're able to do this is the commitment of member states themselves to take their responsibilities seriously and follow through on it. Each individual peacekeeping mission has been asked under A4P to choose a few priorities and to concentrate on those priorities of the 20 different commitments in the declaration. And we will be monitored on that, we will be asked to report on it and so on, and we are in the process of doing that. But where we also need to see some, frankly, accountability, I think, and responsibility is in how the member states themselves will weigh in to support us. And I think that's particularly relevant for the question of the primacy of politics and arriving at political objectives, because we all know that in terms of who has the power to move the needle on politics, it's rarely the UN Secretariat, it's rarely a peacekeeping mission or any other kind of mediation or negotiation on its own. It is always in tandem with member states who are willing to use their political capital to move things forward. And that could be in the framework of the Security Council that unanimously gives a peacekeeping mission or peace operation a very clear mandate, a strong mandate with the right capabilities, but also a Security Council that is willing to hold the parties to account, ask of the parties certain actions so that they can come to a political agreement. There's just so much that the countries can and should do, and I think we need to see more of that. So I think that peacekeeping will continue for some time. We may see less missions over the years. We may see very different missions. I think the important thing is that peacekeeping adapts to the situations on the ground and to the new challenges that we'll surely be facing. New kinds of conflicts, new kinds of conflict actors, new kinds of politics maybe. We need to be nimble and we need to adapt. But I don't want to end on a completely somber note about that and all the challenges. There are, of course, achievements from time to time, and it's not easy to do, but we do arrive at them at times. And Action for Peacekeeping now is it's being used in the Secretariat to try to kind of measure where we are making progress in certain areas, and every once in a while they come out with some information. So, for example, I can mention that MINUSCA, our peacekeeping mission in the Central African Republic, worked closely with the AU and ECAS, a regional organization, as well as the government and armed groups, and a peace agreement was signed in February of 2019, a starting point, hopefully, to get towards peace. MONUSCO, which is our mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that has, to my mind, one of the most complex situations that we are dealing with today, has been working with stakeholders on the basis of a 31 December 2016 political agreement, and they managed to support the country's first ever peaceful transfer of democratic power in January of this year. So that's another achievement that we can mention. I can mention achievements in women, peace and security, which is also a priority for the organization. We've seen through experience that we need more women in peacekeeping, more women in mediation, and we need to have a gender lens to the work that we do to make sure that women are not left out and that their concerns are fully addressed in our peace operations, and we've been making good strides in that area. We've also made strides in lowering our peacekeeper fatalities, and we've been getting better at reducing the amount of conduct and discipline problems. So there is progress, there are achievements, but there's still a very long way to go. The main thing is what do we leave behind? What do we leave for the people of the areas that we serve? Because ultimately, and this I believe very strongly, peacekeeping operations are all about the people, and we need to always ensure that we have people-centered approaches to what we do. So with that, I'll cede the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. You've given us really a very comprehensive overview, not only of the history of peacekeeping, but also of UNFICYP and where we are today. And what I hear particularly is the nature of conflict has changed tremendously. There are vulnerable civilians, there are protection mandates, peacekeepers are being targeted, and I think we've seen a lot more casualties than we had ever thought was possible in the early days. Let me mention one part of it, which is also interesting. It's a factoid, which I've always been surprised about. But peacekeeping is so prevalent because if you look at the regular budget of the United Nations, it's only about 30% of what it costs for peacekeeping. So you have a peacekeeping budget that's 3 times as large as the regular budget of the United Nations, and not many people know that because the cost of it is employing. I'm going to ask you a first question to kick it off, because you talked about the reports as well and referred to them. And if I leave aside the last one now, but particularly focus on the one that was done in 2015, the so-called high-level overview of peacekeeping, which was done with a lot of peacekeepers themselves, so former peacekeepers. And if you how did it resonate with you? What resonated most of the many recommendations, the very many good recommendations that were in there, because you are a practitioner on the ground? What would you like to see the member states deliver most?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be a bit redundant on that one, and it's a bit of an obsession of mine, maybe because I spent so many years in political affairs, but it's the primacy of politics. That was also in the so-called Hippo report, because the UN has an acronym for everything. the high-level advisory panel on peace operations. That was also one of the ones that they underscored the most, the fact that if we just think that the task of a peacekeeping mission or a peace operation of any kind is simply to put a band-aid on something, then we will never leave the peacekeeping theaters. And frankly, this is an issue. We need to have exit strategies. We need to find a way to start a peacekeeping operation on the ground and end it, but end it successfully. And how do you end it successfully? It is primarily by getting peace and getting a lasting peace through some sort of a political deal. So I think for me that is something that is echoed in Action for Peacekeeping, slightly reworded in the Action for Peacekeeping declaration. It talks about advancing lasting political solutions, but I think that is the one that we have to really put our heads towards, because otherwise we'll continue to see perpetuation of these conflicts, and we will see more peacekeeping missions to address new conflicts. But I'm afraid we'll continue to have these other lingering conflicts for many years to come, unless we can find a way amongst all the stakeholders to start resolving some of these issues on the ground.
Okay, excellent. Yes. Let me open it up for Q&As, and if you have a question and if you would briefly introduce yourself, it would be appreciated. Yes, the gentleman on that. Yes.
In the case of a criminal...
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. In the case of a criminal...
Could you please introduce yourself?
Peacekeeper,
Excuse me, could you please introduce yourself?
Sorry, okay. In the case of a criminal... my name is Kamal. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm a legal expert that will ask a legal question. Sorry. In the case of a criminal misbehavior of a peacekeeper, who is responsible, legally responsible, to prosecute the case? Is it, for example, in Cyprus, Northern Cyprus, or the Turkish part, or the sending state? Who is responsible? Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to collect two more?
Sure.
Maybe we can collect another question. I think the gentleman behind you also had a question.
Okay. Hello, thank you very much for this exciting presentation. My name is Andrea Stadler. I'm an Austrian diplomat and currently the ambassador for Malta. Now I have a question as concerns your, of course, view from the top level of the UN about Libya, and your appeal to the member states of the United Nations to put in more political weight and more political support. But if most of the member states, in particular those in the United Nations Security Council, are divided, how can this become possible? And I think we see, in particular in Libya, that it is in a kind of a dead-end situation, of course, with tremendous negative consequences for the population, but also in Central African Republic, that you just mentioned as a positive example, where the United Nations Peacekeeping is doing a tremendous job. We are far from a success story, as you know yourself. So maybe you can compare a little bit these two situations, because I think Cyprus is quite comfortable in comparison to these regions. Thank you so much.
Maybe too comfortable.
We'll take one more. There was someone in the back. Did I say?
Can I try without microphone?
No, because of the voice.
Then I take it with the microphone. I'm Michael. I'm an interested young man. I just didn't get your point with 2019. You said in Congo you achieved what? That's the first question. I didn't hear it. Very good. And the other question would be, is there any engagement of the United Nations in the area of Iran or in the Strait of Hormuz? Somehow a monitoring mission or something like that. Thank you.
Well, very substantive and meaty questions, which will take some time to answer, but it stretches beyond the regular peacekeeping. But please, Elizabeth.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you very much. Very good questions. On the first one with respect to criminal offences and by peacekeepers and where they prosecuted, I mean, the United Nations has certain immunities and privileges for its missions on the ground, but that doesn't mean that we're allowed to break the law. So if a peacekeeper commits an offence according to the local laws, then they will be brought to court. They will be judged. When it comes to serious breaches of our code of conduct, which also can be criminal in nature, so sexual exploitation and abuse, how that is dealt with depends a little bit on who the peacekeeper is. What I mean by that is, and this is one of our challenges, if the individual, the peacekeeper, is a military peacekeeper from the uniformed personnel, the military, it is up to the troop contributing country, so that individual's military and that individual's government to take that issue into their own hands. So sometimes it can be very difficult for the United Nations because we want to make sure that that is dealt with quickly, transparently, and appropriately, and that there be accountability. But the actual actors who have to act on the issue are outside of the sphere of the UN Secretariat. So that's a challenge for us. On cases such as Libya and others that you mentioned, and the problem of getting member state action on such very deeply conflicted contexts, I can only say that the UN is only too painfully aware of the problems that we have in getting the proper member state action on many of these things. Our Secretary General has often been very concerned about a Security Council that seems to be more and more divided on so many issues that really urgently cry out for a unified response. He links it to a serious crisis in multilateralism. Nowadays, the solidarity that one would hope is there to tackle problems collectively is rather weak in many issues. Let's just take climate change, for example, and the fact that we just had a huge climate change summit at the margins of the General Assembly in New York just a few short days ago. And I think the hopes of the Secretary General and of many was that member states would come out and pledge very strongly about how they were going to tackle climate change and increase their pledges. And the response was, I think, not anywhere near what was hoped. So there doesn't seem to be, let's say, an ideal situation right now in terms of strong multilateralism with everyone pulling together, and a Security Council that is unified on all the key issues. It's quite the contrary, and all I can say about that is that we're very conscious of it, and we need to see what can be done. The Secretary General not long ago addressed the Security Council on the topic of mediation in conflicts, because a very big theme of the Secretary General is prevention. So that his basic point is that before we even get to a serious violent conflict, we need to try to mediate, to facilitate, to use all the peaceful conflict resolution tools in our toolkit, which emanate from our charter, to try to avert deep, serious, violent conflict from flaring in the first place. And he also talked about mediation being used to resolve conflicts once they have burst out into the open. And in his address to the Security Council on mediation, what struck me was his final point was making an appeal for unity in the Council, thereby showing that he was very cognizant of the fact that, again, in order to solve many of these things, we have to try to get, somehow there has to be a way that the Council can unite behind a common approach to some of these really deadly conflicts. In terms of clarifying what I said about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I had simply mentioned that our mission on the ground, a very big, complex mission on the ground, MONUSCO, was part of the process that enabled the Congo to go from this 31 December 2016 political agreement and holding the country's first ever peaceful transfer of democratic power this last January. So that was something that was achieved. In terms of work on Iran and many other very complicated areas of the world, what I can tell you is that we don't necessarily have a peacekeeping mission or a peace operation everywhere in the world where there are issues and challenges and conflicts and problems, but there is a lot of quiet diplomacy that goes on. And again, the United Nations Secretariat tries to use a range of tools, including preventive diplomacy, quiet diplomacy, to try to have an impact in complicated theaters. So even though we may not have a peacekeeping operation everywhere, we do try to work with local actors, often very quietly behind the scenes, to try to resolve serious problems and issues. Yeah.
And are there any tries of installing some kind of monitoring engagement in the Strait of Hormuz? Because now this just two actors saying it was you.
Yeah. No, not that I'm aware of. One of our basic principles is consent. So we would have to get member states from that immediate area to agree to something of that kind, which, as far as I know, has not occurred. So some of the cardinal principles in peacekeeping and in the UN as a whole are principles such as impartiality and consent as well. We don't go out and impose ourselves in context.
Let me just add something here, because this is a very important point that Elizabeth just raised, and you need the consent, but very often what you don't see, it still goes on, meaning that when you have high-level meetings like the one that took place last week, you have a lot of consultations among heads of state or foreign ministers, and there are agreements reached that don't necessarily get put on the headlines in the paper or on social media or something. So there are often understandings that are going on. But when you look at the proceedings of the Security Council, that's where you really see the divisions as they become apparent. I mean, Iran is being dealt with primarily in the context of non-proliferation, but not necessarily, as let's say, the controlling of the Strait of Hormuz. So that is one thing that the Secretary General, as she said, has been underlined, that there is a crisis in the Security Council where not all member states see eye to eye. And with Iran particularly, the Security Council did adopt a resolution supporting the JCPOA. So basically what the United States did is against international law, because that is binding. The Security Council decisions are binding, resolutions are binding on the states concerned. So that is a very difficult issue to handle. We're not going to stay only on Iran, so maybe we can give it a rest in a minute and catch it up later. Okay, can we do that? And let me open up a little more for other questions, since there's a huge area that Elizabeth can cover. Yes, Martin.
The microphone.
Yeah.
Budget. You mentioned about the size of the peacekeeping budget and how it dwarfs the regular budget for the rest of the UN Secretariat's operations. But obviously, both budgets are really stretched at the moment, not because there's a financial crisis, but because there's a cash flow problem. Without boring everybody with the details, this is presumably having a direct impact on peacekeeping operations. Maybe you could give us a little bit of an insight into how.
Do we have another question before we take up? Yeah, okay.
First of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have a question concerning peacekeeping. I mean, would you say that you need peace first to keep peace? I mean, what I'm trying to say is, in the case when there is no ceasefire, like how can you actually work on the ground? And my second question would be about women, peace and security. I mean, you mentioned that you try to bring more women into this area, and especially also into the peace workers on the ground. My question therefore is, for example, in countries like Libya was mentioned, or Syria, or MINUSCO in more patriarchal societies, is this really working on the ground? I mean, do they actually like have a chance there then to work?
We have two more requests, Johannes, and the gentleman guy. Yeah. Yes, it was you.
Okay. There was somebody else. Well, thank you too. Thank you also. Many thanks also to the IIP for organizing this. My name is Kane. I'm a researcher, special work on Turkish foreign policy, and I'm very much interested in the second part of your job, or in the second part of your mission, and that's the facilitating a political solution on the island. As far as I can remember, the last round of talks, negotiations collapsed back in 2017. But nevertheless, there were reports saying that there was major progress in very substantial issues related to security and guarantees, and that Turkey reportedly showed some flexibility, or even saying that zero guarantees might work as well. And I wanted to ask you, are there any prospects for these negotiations to restart? And can we expect for different parameters, for a game changer in the negotiations, for new ideas put forward by the Secretary General? Thank you.
Can we have those three, and then we'll have one more round afterwards, Thomas? Is that okay? Yeah. Otherwise, it gets too long a list, because these are very substantive questions. Elizabeth, need you too.
Okay, that was I was already going to number 9 here. Yes. Yeah. In terms of the peacekeeping budget, I can tell you that in all of the peacekeeping missions, because of the and rightly so, the concerns of member states that there not be wastage and that we're all fit for purpose, most peacekeeping budgets have been really cut to the bone. So the problem is when there is a cash flow problem, or there is a problem of getting sufficient resources to peacekeeping missions, they're just things that we have to stop doing. So it's not a question of, can we do more of this or more of that, of the other. There will simply be, if the money doesn't get to the peacekeeping missions, there will be certain aspects of the budget that will not be fulfilled. And as I said, there are some very critical issues that people on the ground rely on these peacekeeping missions for, and they simply will not be able to fulfill them if they don't get the resources that they need. The mission that I'm heading is one of our smaller operations. So our budget, it may not sound very small, but our budget is really quite modest compared to most of the big missions. It is now at $50 million US dollars a year. 43% of that is covered by the Republic of Cyprus and Greece. So the amount that the rest of the membership pays is actually quite modest in peacekeeping terms. And that is a budget that has really it hasn't grown in the last few years. In fact, it has been cut back and trimmed. And I can tell you that our instructions from headquarters is really always to stay to a zero growth budget and even cut if we can, because we're cognizant of the fact that member states are trying to keep the cost down, but it does have serious consequences on the ground if the money is not available. How do you get to peace when there's no ceasefire? I mean, this is a critical point, and this is one of the, if you will, relatively new phenomena of peacekeeping missions that I alluded to earlier, and that is that we're in ever more complex theaters where you're not really a peacekeeping mission as was originally conceived, going in to keep the peace. You're going into a war zone. And there has been debate among member states as to whether we should have missions on the ground where there's no peace to keep. The point is, how do you get to create the minimal conditions so that peace perhaps could be brokered? And there again is this issue that I also mentioned in relation to our peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, which is trying to create the minimal conditions conducive, a platform of foundation, so that peace could be negotiated out. So even when things look like they're extremely dire and you're in virtually a war zone, in another one of our missions with tremendous challenges is the one that's deployed in Mali. Mali has had for a number of years now the highest number of peacekeeper fatalities. More than 100 peacekeepers have died in the Malian context, and you can imagine how many Malians have died in this conflict. And yet we're still there, and we're having small achievements on the ground. But it is honestly a worthwhile point to debate, especially if you have a peacekeeping mission that has too ambitious a mandate, not enough resources, not enough member state support. Should it be thrown to the lions and try to build conditions for peace when there almost seems to be none available? It's a serious question, but I think the Security Council has often weighed in favor of trying to do something on the ground to create the basics from which you can build towards peace. In terms of women, peace and security, and whether it's possible to really live up to the commitments on women, peace and security in a number of contexts, including Syria and so forth, I mean, you would be surprised. There have been quite a few advances, and on the Syrian file, I can simply say that the last several envoys that we've had on Syria, from Stefan de Mistura to Geir Peterson right now, have actively engaged Syrian women from civil society to make sure that they have a voice at the table. And this is something that may seem more difficult in certain cultural contexts than in others, but it is now a strong commitment at the United Nations, and we're working actively to make sure that there is a voice. In the context of Cyprus, I can tell you that even though we are in a much more benign context, you would be surprised how challenging it still is to get women, peace and security taken seriously. There was a technical committee on gender equality during the negotiations, in the last round of negotiations, that was created by both sides, but pretty much on the urging of the United Nations. I think if we hadn't been mildly persuasive on that, we wouldn't have seen this. And even with this technical committee on gender equality being part of the Track 1 process, it still had a lot of limitations and problems in terms of actually being effective. So it's not easy. I find many member states pay lip service to women, peace and security, but when it comes to actually acting on the ground, it takes some doing. So on the one hand, I can definitely report advances, including in cultural contexts that might seem difficult, but still a long way to go, I should admit. Yeah. And finally, on the Cyprus negotiations, whether there are prospects that they would restart, could there be different parameters, new ideas put forward by the Secretary General? As you might be aware, as the gentleman said, we had quite a promising round of negotiations roughly between May 2015 to early July 2017. A lot of progress was made, and I was quite deeply involved in that myself, and I can say that we really felt as United Nations that the contours of a successful deal were being shaped. Of course, some of the important outstanding issues were some of the toughest ones, but in Crans-Montana in Switzerland in June and July of 2017, with the direct involvement of our Secretary General, we got quite close to the sides agreeing on 6 key outstanding points, which had to do with security and guarantees, which had to do with governance and power sharing arrangements, and some of the other key outstanding points on property and so on. Unfortunately, despite the efforts, the sides couldn't agree and things got so acrimonious that it ended in the closing of the process. And people often ask why that was. I think there are a number of reasons. I think at the end of the day, we just didn't have enough of the basic trust in the room that everyone was going to fulfill their side of the bargain. And the only way that we were going to finalize a deal on some of these key outstanding issues would have been for everyone to compromise at the same time across the remaining elements. And there was just too much fear, I think, that if I move to finalize this point that I know the other side wants, if I advance that, I may not get what I need. And the thing fell apart. Now we have a consultations process that's trying to see whether everybody agrees, the key actors agree to go back to the table and basically pick up where we left off. The idea is to finalize terms of reference that would be the basis for a return to negotiations. The Secretary General met with all of the parties in the margins of the General Assembly just a few days ago, and he has offered to re-engage with the sides when they're ready, and he's hoping that they will do some more work to move towards each other, and if they really have a common blueprint, a basic common blueprint for how they'd like to go back, he will be ready to support them, and we on the ground will also be ready to support them. So there is a possibility out there, but the sides need to converge on how they will move forward. I don't think any new ideas from the Secretary General could ever be a substitute for the will of the parties themselves.
I think this last sentence is extremely important. Nothing can substitute for the political will of the parties themselves. And there's a saying around the UN and those of the people who are involved in it is like, a situation is to be ripe. Well, that is true, but on the other hand, I think there's a lot that can be done also to maybe ripen it. But what we have to see in Cyprus particularly is that 3 generations in essence have grown up since the conflict first erupted. So the institutional memory of a life together on the island really has been lost, and I think that that's really important. I want to say something before we go into the last round, and that is because Elizabeth was talking about the dangerous situation. I mean, not only peacekeepers who were killed, but also civilians who were killed. And of course, the civilians are only a much smaller part of the missions. And let me make a plug here for the people who volunteer to go to these missions, particularly the dangerous ones. But any mission really has danger in it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be necessary. And what it is you get sent out to a country, you're without your family has to stay home, you're totally isolated, and you are voluntarily there. And it's not like you're getting danger pay or something. I mean, there's no incentive in that matter. Soldiers, you can order. The government sort of says, I sent this contingent to a certain country, and if it is dangerous, well, so be it. But with civilians, you don't have that. You actually have people who are very committed and very idealistic and are really trying to contribute to a positive outcome of a situation that they're being put in. So I salute Elizabeth and all those who have been in these situations. Now we're going to have a last round, and then we're going to close. And I know that, Hannes, you had a question?
Yeah. Hannes, the President of IIP. I have 2 questions. The one on Cyprus, I'm very skeptic about Cyprus. I've been in contact with both sides since about 2 decades, and I don't see a real willingness to do it. As Angela said, if you live very long, more or less separated, you are used to it, and you, of course, complain it, but you got more used to it. My question concerning is, there's a new conflict, and the conflict is about energy resources, oil and especially gas in the sea. I deplore very much that it was not used by all the parties to come to an agreement of cooperation between Cyprus, the Greek side, the Turkish side, Turkey, Israel, Egypt, and so on. Of course, I know that the relationship between Turkey and Egypt and Turkey and Israel is not the best one. But my question is the UN in any way trying to help to find this possibility of energy cooperation in that field to give an impetus perhaps to a new peace development situation in Cyprus? The second question, a very pragmatic one. and just spoke about the civilian. I want to speak about the military. It seems the UN gets enough military for the peacekeeping operations when they need it. How are they prepared? Because one thing is that you have military, I don't know, I mentioned India because I think many of the peacekeepers come from India. But the other thing is to go into peacekeeping, to have that contact with the citizens, to be supportive of citizens, to see the civilian side in a totally different culture, maybe, or probably very often. So how are the people prepared to act in that very difficult, foreign, maybe strange environment with totally different conflicts than they are perhaps used from at home?
Okay. So we have one more question. Yes, gentleman.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Chrysostomos, the Deputy Chief Commissioner of Cyprus here in Austria. We are thankful as Cypriots for the presence of UNFICYP, and through Mrs. Spehar, I'd like to thank UNFICYP, the UN Security Council, and UN in general for the presence. UNFICYP has a critical role in Cyprus to play since 1964 and the creation of UNFICYP. And unfortunately, still the mandate provided through 186, Resolution 186 back in 1964 is still valid, unfortunately, because as Cypriots, we don't want any conflict in our island because it's such a beautiful place to have such an issue destroying our future, present future. Past is already gone, so we have to stick on the future. Building on what has been said previously about the efficiency of the peacekeeping force in Cyprus, how do you see the numbers of the peacekeeping force? Because for the past few years, stable, around 860, more or less. And how this helps the peacekeeping force in Cyprus to implement its role, which is basically maintaining the peace in the island. For the past few years, and let me say it as a Cypriot, not as a Cypriot diplomat, UNFICYP has been a very good example a successful example of maintaining peace in the island. It might be a long one as a mission, but it's a successful one because no major issues have been on the ground since 1974 and the Turkish invasion, after the ceasefire agreement in 16th of August 1974. And also a compliment to UNFICYP for being able to advance the gender equality in the peacekeeping force, and the fact that the heads of the different departments of UNFICYP, starting with you, Mrs. Spehar, are all women for the past few years, and it's a major, very good example for the UN. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're having one more? A very short question. Thank you.
I'm just interested if peacekeeping actors never minded of our civilian or military today engaged in learning the language, Turkish and Greek?
Okay. All right. And any more? Then no? I think then I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So many really great questions, so I'm very, very grateful for that. It makes it a lot more interesting, I think, for all of us. Our head of UNIP was mentioning that he's been in contact with and involved with the Cyprus issue or Cyprus actors for several decades, and you were quite skeptical about whether people actually wanted to reunite. It's been a long time, they've been separated and so forth. I mean, it's quite interesting because we've been supportive of some polling on the island, and there are a number of different organizations that regularly do surveys about people's perceptions in Cyprus. And the latest polling basically shows that there is a majority on both sides of the divide, both Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, who do want a solution. That's the good news. The less good news is that when you ask them if they think it's actually going to happen, the numbers drop quite substantially. And that's simply because, of course, the longer a conflict endures, the more, yes, skeptical and sometimes disillusioned people become. But I think it's heartening that in essence, people still do want this. They want it to happen. And one of the things that I think is incredibly important, and I alluded to it when I was talking about UNFICYP's role on the ground, is that we are trying to actively help Cypriots from across the divide meet each other, get to know each other, understand the way the other side is perceiving the situation, and trying to basically build what I call a constituency for peace, because the leaders are trying to get back together to renew negotiations and to get a comprehensive settlement. But I think it's also very important that they get encouragement from the population itself. Cypriots don't tend to be very publicly demonstrative about these things, but I think that the more that Cypriots from across the divide get to know each other, get to understand the grievances of both sides and to understand the benefits of reuniting, the more they can encourage the leaders to actually stay the course. And I think that citizens' involvement and citizens' engagement is absolutely crucial. And if you look at the last number of Security Council resolutions on Cyprus, the Security Council also tends to agree. They have constantly been asking the leaders on Cyprus to improve the public discourse, stop the blame game, put out more positive messages about a solution, engage civil society, directly support civil society to basically create the proper atmosphere and the fertile soil on which a solution could take root. So I think that, I do believe that the longer time goes, goes on, more facts are created on the ground and the more difficult it will be. But that doesn't mean that it cannot happen, and I think the citizens' own commitment to this and their active engagement is an ingredient that we often take for granted. I think it's incredibly important. And it is a challenge because, as you say, and as Angela has also said, people have grown apart in separate solitudes now for many years. So it's a challenge. In terms of the issue of the hydrocarbons, the UN is not engaging in this area in any specific way. What our Secretary General has repeatedly said, however, is that hydrocarbons, as you have yourself said, and the possibility of energy development around the island could be a real boon and something that that will benefit Cypriots across the island. But for that, you need to take this issue and not make it a source of conflict, but make it a source of peace. And that the best way to achieve a successful development of these hydrocarbons resources is probably to solve the Cyprus problem. So we limit ourselves to simply saying that these resources, it has been agreed in the negotiations in the past, would be shared by both sides in a united Cyprus. It can be a real boon to the entire island. But let's focus on keeping the tensions low over this issue and solving the Cyprus problem. In terms of military, coming from a totally different culture and how are they prepared to go to very different places and interact with different cultures, different languages, different situations. Something that's very important, and it's also part again of the action for peacekeeping principles, is proper preparation and proper training of peacekeepers. So before peacekeepers military are deployed to a peacekeeping mission, they go through something called pre-deployment training, and this is training that is done by their own military, but very much guided by the UN Secretariat. And the idea is that they have the proper tools to be able to fulfill their work. And it's quite interesting in the Cyprus case because thankfully we have not had a fatality on the island linked directly to the Cyprus conflict since the late 90s. Security-wise, it's a much more benign environment than many of the other contexts that we've been talking about. But it's very complex in other ways, and there are security concerns. So the military need to get trained also on their more diplomatic mediation skills, and not necessarily the hard skills that they're used to before they go to Cyprus, because what they need to do is diffuse tensions along the ceasefire lines and resolve problems that arise, really by using a firm approach, but very much by using diplomacy. So they need to in a way understand their mission very differently than they would in other live conflict contexts. And so pre-deployment training is part of it. They also get further training and orientation once they get to the mission theater, including on issues that I mentioned before, such as conduct and discipline, sexual exploitation and abuse. There is a zero tolerance policy by the United Nations. They need to know that before they even start their first day of work. And they also get, if you will, training or orientation on the theater itself, on the people, the basic. They also need to get a basic understanding of the politics of the place. Otherwise, I think they would have a real difficulty doing their job, especially in a place as politically complicated as Cyprus. In terms of whether the peacekeepers learn Turkish and/or Greek, if you're talking about the military, we usually have 6-month rotations, so they're in for 6 months and they rotate out. So it would be a lot to ask of them to do so. It would be great if they did. Most of us have had some instruction in either Turkish or Greek or both. I cannot say I really speak very much, but I understand increasingly. I think it would be desirable, but the language we usually use in the mission is English, I hate to say. The efficiency of peacekeeping forces, your question, and the numbers in UNFICYP. So currently UNFICYP has an authorized strength by the Security Council of 860 military, but we are only allowed at this point to deploy 802. So we actually have 802 military on the ground, 69 police, and about 150 to 200 civilians, most of them national civilians. So we actually have a very small civilian component, about 38 internationals. Are those numbers adequate? My military, in terms of the military numbers, tell me they are barely adequate, and that if the Security Council were to ask us to cut anywhere below that number, we would have quite a bit of difficulty doing our job. Again, I mentioned just the very length and breadth of the buffer zone, the need to make sure that we're constantly around. We have some observation posts that are still manned, but most of what we do to try to keep calm and stability and monitor what's going on is we have patrolling. And the only way with 802 soldiers we can patrol that large an area is by doing it at certain times of the day. We cannot be everywhere all the time. It's simply impossible with the numbers that we have. In terms of the of women, peace, and security, since I was given the possibility in fact, patting ourselves on the back a little bit, I'm very pleased that UNFICYP has been one of the lead peacekeeping missions in terms of women's participation in peacekeeping. So I am actually the third female heading UNFICYP, but I was also the second because there was a woman many years ago, I think from Dame Herkel from New Zealand, I believe. Then I was the second one, briefly, in 2008. Angela will remember that. I was deployed for a short-term period as interim SRSG on the ground. Then my predecessor was Lisa Buttenheim, and now I'm back more than 3 years. But we also had the first female force commander, so the first female to head a military component in a peacekeeping mission was General Kristin Lund from Norway. She's now heading a mission of her own, UNSO, in the region. And we now have the second female force commander currently on the ground, General Cheryl Ann Pierce from Australia, doing a fantastic job. We also had a senior police advisor woman from Norway with us. Unfortunately, she has left now, but she also was a trailblazer. And in terms of numbers, I can tell you 36% of our police are women and 10.5%, don't ask me how the 0.5 gets in there, but these are my figures, so I'm sticking to them, 10.5% or so of our military are female. Of course, they rotate in and out all the time, so I think they're just giving me the average. Some people say, well, okay, because you're in such a benign context, that's why all the women go to Cyprus, but that's actually not what's really going on. We have made a conscious effort to do this in our troop contributing countries. The Brits, the Argentines, the Slovaks have been quite conscious about trying to bring up the number of women. And it's not just for the pleasure of having more women around, it's simply because we know that peacekeeping is more effective when more women are involved. And in addition to that, we've been doing a lot of work in terms of gender mainstreaming in the mission, so making sure that what we're doing as peacekeepers resonates with women as well as men on the ground. And finally, as part of that, we've been working increasingly, and that links up with what I mentioned a moment ago with respect to citizens' engagement. We're working more and more with women's groups on the ground, Turkish Cypriot and Greek Cypriot, many of whom, a number of whom are working together, who want to make a difference both in terms of promoting gender equality, greater gender equality in Cyprus, but also more women directly in the peace process. There's a lot that can be done, a lot more that needs to be done, but we're very actively working with women on the ground.
Well, that's a very positive way of ending, so let's give her a big hand. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think that, as usual, we have a little glass of something or the other being offered in the back of the room, so if you'd like to stay and chat a little bit over a glass of wine or water, you're most welcome, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.